Welcome. We're glad you're here. And I know you've got a very busy schedule. We have a short period of time, so let's get focused. One question I always like to start off at the top of these conversations is to set the context for how you approach your job. You've had a very unique career growing up in Bulgaria behind the Iron Curtain, the fall of the Berlin Wall, as you reminded me in October when we were celebrating the anniversary of the Bretton Woods institutions. We were also celebrating the fall of the Berlin Wall. But that shaped who you are and how you approach policy solutions, policy problems. Tell me a little bit about how that colors your worldview.
But the fact that I'm not only the first managing director from an emerging market economy, but I come from a country that has lived through a very substantial IMF adjustment program, of course matters. In the mid-90s, I witnessed how bad policies destroyed our economy. Hyperinflation wiped out the savings of my mother. And I had to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning to queue to buy milk for my daughter. So to put it very simply, I learned firsthand both the cost of bad policies and the benefits of good policies. And I want to be an agent of bringing this. I think I now have too much mic. You don't have enough, and I have, well, which one? Okay, I'll use this. What is important is that I also bring to the job the fact that my personal life story is an improbable one. If anybody was to tell me in the 80s, when I was living in communist Bulgaria, that one day I would run the IMF, I would have laughed. I was a professor in a university with the name Karl Marx. So what I bring is two very important messages. One, change is unstoppable. An economic system that was bankrupt sooner or later would go belly up, and that is what happened in our case. We had to move from non-market to market economy. And two, nothing is impossible. If I can run the IMF coming from where I come from, obviously we have to believe in that capacity to do very difficult things and always believe that we can make them right. And of course, it helps that I have run the European Commission and I run the World Bank as I come to run the fund.
And so given that, your priorities, I know on your blog that you wrote this morning as you were coming in, obviously these priorities pertain to this meeting, but you talked about climate, you talked about the importance of trade, and the importance of inequality, not something that the IMF has been known to focus on in previous years. Certainly trade has been a part of the suite of topics but the fund, but why those three items and why for this meeting?
Well, I concentrated on these three items as we step into the meetings because they are very significant to be addressed at the time when we live with more uncertainty. Trade tensions added to uncertainty, especially last year. We have seen how that put a drag on global growth. And we also have seen how reducing trade tensions benefited growth. What I wanted to flag is twofold. One, there is still a way to go to further eliminate uncertainties related to trade. And that I really hope policymakers will walk this extra mile. But two, that we should not narrow down our focus only to what has come as tensions between large economies. We ought to recognize that our trade system has fallen behind times. What we do not integrate in WTO still are services, the fastest growing segment of our economy, e-commerce, which is transforming the way we trade. And we haven't yet quite resolved issues around intellectual property rights. So we have to acknowledge the necessity to invest in a trade system for the future, because even if trade occasionally has negative impacts of those that are excluded from the benefits of trade, it has served us well. It is good for growth, it is good for jobs, it is good for poverty reduction. We don't pay enough attention to who benefits the most from trade, and it is the poorer households. In an advanced economy, a rich household sees 1/4 of cost of goods shrinking because of division of labor and trade. So it is 25% cheaper to buy what people buy. But for a poor household, it is 2/3. A poor household benefits significantly more from trade. So we have to think about trade as an engine for growth, but also linked to the topic of inequality. And if I may, I will go straight to it. Why we talk about inequalities and want policymakers to focus more on this issue? Well, for one, they have expanded. They have expanded in the last decade more than it is healthy for growth and well-being of people. And because what we now see is that deepening of inequalities creates very serious problems for the social fabric of countries. This last year, 2019, we saw a number of countries abruptly stepping into domestic protests that pulled back growth. And we can name Chile and Ecuador and Lebanon and Iraq. Hong Kong was a different story, but also Hong Kong. If we want societies to grow faster, this growth has to be more inclusive. And for those of you who are from the financial institutions here, we did a piece of research that came with a counterintuitive conclusion that financial deepening, in other words, more people having access to financial services, more businesses having access to financial services, up to a point is very good for inequality. In other words, gives more opportunities, inequality shrinks. But from one point upward, financial deepening increases inequality. And when we dig into this, why? Mostly because of the sophistication of financial instruments that come with further financial deepening, and therefore leading to excluding those who cannot really cope with this sophistication. So what we say from the fund is, it is a macro-critical topic. It is relevant for the quality and sustainability of growth. Thus, we have to face it.
But you know, there's the phrase that capitalism without capital is just another ism. Isn't it then, to your point about inequality and financial deepening, isn't it about helping those at the lower end of the income spectrum have access to financial instruments that those at the top of the income spectrum have access to, and who've benefited from a hugely buoyant equity market?
Well, that is, this is what we thought, that more access in perpetuity leads to less inequality. But the evidence is not supporting this, this conclusion. And now what we landed in was we need to think much more systematically about financial literacy, about making it so that there is intermediary between small and medium-sized enterprises, entrepreneurs stepping in, and the financial instruments that are so sophisticated that people may not understand them. We also see that this sophistication may lead to in lack of understanding risk to gobbling up more risk just because of ignorance of the consequences. And this is why we are stressing that we have to think of building access to financial instruments for everyone with increased sophistication of these instruments. In fact, financial literacy probably should become mandatory subject in schools because otherwise we might be letting part of our society fall behind.
Those are two big priorities in addition to your standard economic surveillance, which I'll come back to in a moment. We talk a little bit about the economic outlook. But the other topic that was in your blog is a huge issue, which is climate change. Why does the IMF, why are you involved in climate at all? What's your mandate?
Because climate change is macro-critical. And it is macro-critical in two dimensions. One, with more recognition of the need to price carbon one way or another, and more jurisdictions embracing a stimulus for decarbonization one way or another. Some may do it through regulation, not through price, but we see this movement quite clearly with the European Union adopting their Green Deal. That means that decarbonization is going to impact financial institutions because of the content of portfolios they hold. Therefore, this transitional risk that comes with the decarbonization is one we need to understand. We have to be able to help companies disclose, and to the extent possible, we should be able to also stress test financial institutions for this new category of risk. And two, the second one is much more obvious to all of us. Climate-related natural disasters are already impacting especially countries and communities that are most vulnerable to droughts, to floods, to hurricanes. We saw Maria wiping out the economy of the Dominica, equivalent of 225% of GDP. Well, if you're holding these assets, or if you're an insurance company, what do? There has to be a much more standardized way to project this risk. And I actually think of this more as an opportunity. If we can quantify where the risks are, then we can also embrace action as an opportunity. I, for one thing, that low carbon, climate resilient economies are to come, and those who invest in this low carbon, climate resilient future first are going to reap off the benefits of competitive strength. And for our friends from countries that are oil producing, there is also technological opportunities in carbon capture and storage. At a certain level of carbon price, these opportunities become very viable. So we should not hide away from what is already coming. The climate crisis is upon us. It is not something that is far in the future. We should say how we can make the best out of it to generate growth and jobs in the process.
So, but what role do you play? What leverage? You have moral suasion. You're obviously a talented speaker. What tools does the fund have in order to affect change?
So here we are. We do have the tools. Our best tool, that is also best known to everybody, is surveillance. Every year, or almost every year, we have a mandate to look at how economies are shaping up, and especially in financial stability, monetary system, growth directions. And in this process, for countries that are particularly vulnerable to climate risks, we are already integrating in surveillance an assessment of what is the risk, but most importantly, what can they do about it? And you wouldn't be surprised we start from the island economies that are most vulnerable to hurricanes. Similarly, we are going to take on surveillance for countries interested in that on the whole spectrum of transitional and disaster risks. We have been discussing with our Japanese friends. Japan might be interested next year in their Article 4 consultation to look into that, because Japan is highly vulnerable to shocks caused by not only climate but other forces of nature. And that is a very, very present and very important issue for them. Our second very important tool is financial sector assessment, the so-called FSAPs. And I can tell you that from now on, we are not going to have an FSAP in which we don't look at that category of risk. We may say it is not a significant risk, therefore we don't want to go there. But if it is a more significant risk, we owe it to our members to give them our best advice on how they can stay ahead of the curve, handle it before it is more dramatic. You have heard the governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, talking about somewhere between $4 and $20 trillion that may be in stranded assets. Not my number, so I'm not going to sign under it. But what I can say is that the magnitude can be quite significant. And I think we can do well to work with countries on that. We are also determined to help in financial disclosure of climate-related risks. And then it would be a mainstream topic that the financial community handles. Many of you probably know that the fund invented stress testing 20 years ago. Well, we should not sit on our achievements. We should look into what more we can do to expand it.
And what do you say to the countries, whether it's India or it's South Africa, others that say it's great for you wealthy Western countries to talk about climate and moving to a low carbon or zero carbon economy, but we're earlier on the growth stage. We want the same prosperity, the same affluence you do, and the way we're going to get there is the same way you got there, and you're denying us that right to growth. How do you respond to the equality, equity issue?
I have two points to make. The first one is that, remember, the world made a promise of $100 billion to help countries, the poorer countries, cope with climate change. I think it is very important that we stick to fulfilling this promise. It has to be recognized that indeed poorer countries need to be helped. Otherwise, they would be struggling to make choices between dealing with extreme poverty today and removing the reasons for extreme poverty tomorrow, because climate is going to hit very hard, especially the poor and most vulnerable. World Bank estimates that by 2030, there would be 100 million more extremely poor people because of climate change. Where do you think they're going to be? They would be in India and in sub-Saharan Africa. So they have to be helped. But the second is that, look, this is an opportunity also for leapfrogging. Take solar. Solar was super expensive. While now in Zambia, IFC and others are supporting scaling up solar, and solar is the cheapest source of energy. Why would you go for the more expensive one if you can do the cheapest? So for some developing countries, they also need to think, do I really want to be stuck in what is kind of past, or I want to leapfrog in the future? I'll give you my very simple personal example. Since last July, my car is a Tesla. I bought electric. How many of you drive electric in the audience? Electric car drivers? We're in Saudi Arabia, but even here I saw Teslas. So let me tell you very, very frankly, there is no way I'm going to go into a gas or diesel vehicle, because Tesla is a superior, not Tesla. An electric car is a superior car. I cannot make.
You almost made a commercial for them.
No. And they have their their issues. It is as simple as that. That in mobility, the future is electric, or something, maybe hydrogen, but it's something different. And I think we should not give bad advice to developing countries of buying something that may belong to the pages of history.
Wonderful. Let's get to the heart of the fun. It's surveillance. I saw you at the World Economic Forum. You had a forecast at that time. A lot has changed since then. The coronavirus, COVID-19 has certainly changed the tenor and the tone with which we think about the economic trajectory for the year. You're not an epidemiologist, but you do talk to many of them. How do you see this playing out over the coming weeks and months?
Well, it is the broader message from coronavirus is that we do live in a more shock-prone world, and therefore we have to get accustomed to more uncertainty. And as policymakers, we have to make every effort possible to reduce uncertainty through the policies we project, give predictability to businesses, take trade tensions, stay out of what may be adding to uncertainty. On the coronavirus, what we know and what we don't know. What we know is that it is an epidemic different from SARS in 2002. We know that China, the Chinese economy, is different from the one that was then. It is much bigger part of the world economy, much more integrated in Asia and in the rest of the world. And we also, unfortunately, know that today growth is more fragile than it was in 2002. So those who make comparison with SARS may be taking us to a rosier place than we are going to land. What we don't know still is how exactly the virus spreads and how extensively it would go beyond China. We don't know. We don't know yet with certainty how quickly it would be contained, and as it is being contained, to what extent the impact, the spillover to the world economy would be bigger or smaller. So with this constraint, at the IMF, we are still we are operating with scenarios. We are not operating with precise projections because of the uncertainties. But we still project as the most likely scenario a V-shaped impact of the virus, in which a very abrupt and significant drop in China will be followed by fairly rapid recovery, and the spillover to the rest of the world would be moderate. But we recognize there are other scenarios that can be significantly more impactful. What we call for is to recognize that the very best option we have as a global community is to act in a synchronized, or even better, coordinated fashion. Our monetary policy space to respond is limited, but it is not zero. We still have a number of countries can continue in a more accommodative direction. A number of countries have fiscal space to act to create stimulus, and China is among these countries. And we all have the capacity to look at ways in which we can prompt up the world economy through more appetite for structural reforms, which we have been kind of slow to do. My positive message to us as an audience is last year, as you remember, the world has slipped into a synchronized slowdown. 90% of the world economy slowed in 2019. That made 2019 the worst performing year for the world since the financial crisis. But central banks acted in a similarly synchronized manner. 49 central banks cut interest rates 71 times. And the impact of this is a very significant 0.5 percentage point boost of global growth. So we ended the year 2019 with 2.9% growth, could have been 2.4, and those who follow the IMF know that when we dip under 2.5%, we are not really happy. I mean, then a word that starts with R starts coming to mind. Not to be named, ever.
Obviously, additional accommodative policy in Europe is fairly challenged because of negative interest rates. Do you worry about negative interest rates? And I ask that question because we have even some of our European institutions here. Net interest margins are thin or falling. It's tough to make money in the maturity transformation business if you've got a yield curve that's downward sloping. Do you worry about negative interest rates?
Yes, we do. We worry about negative interest rates over a prolonged period of time. So we don't see this to be a desirable long-term prospect. But in the short term, we worry more about recession and loss of jobs. And we think that on balance, the accommodative monetary policy that we are experiencing now is the right thing to do with the wobbly growth of the world. However, we do look at risks that a prolonged period of time of negative interest rates brings. One is, I'm sure you would want to talk about that. One is money is cheap. What happens when money is cheap? We all borrow and then borrow more.
Yes.
But the second thing is even more significant than the absolute increase of debt, and it is the search for yield. Well, when you go for yield in low interest rate environment, your appetite for risk goes up. And then at some point, maybe we are piling up more risk than we can easily carry.
You and I have had this conversation, but on debt transparency, I'll get to about levels of debt. In this expansion, we've seen record levels relative to GDP, household, corporate, sovereign levels, sub-sovereign.
Yep.
At what point do you begin to get nervous about the capacity to service that debt? What are you looking for? What are the component pieces?
I use a very simple analogy when we talk about debt pile up, and it is the frog in boiling water. So the frog is very comfortable, water is very pleasant, and it keeps swimming around until that moment when the frog is dead. This is the risk we are facing, that incremental pile-up of debt in low interest environments doesn't give us a good signal to, again, to go back to the frog, to jump out of the boiling water on time. And for this reason, and when I hear people talking about low forever, interest rates are going to be low forever, don't worry, like you frog, sit in the water, no problem. I am actually, I think it is our duty as a professional community to ring the alarm bell that we might be reaching a point when much more attention has to be given to that. The good news is that we have seen in the last couple of years more attention being given to that. In advanced economies, a pile-up of debt in most advanced economies leveled up, even has trimmed down in some countries. And even in developing countries over the last 2 years, since we started both the IMF and the World Bank and others, we started talking about the danger of that. We have seen more moderation. We have still seen stabilization of that levels. We do need to emphasize the most important step to protect the frog from boiling, that transparency.
It's an issue we've been talking about for
As
some time.
long as we actually know what is above water and what is the iceberg under, we can assess the risk properly. If we don't know, then the frog is in deep trouble.
And do you think you know? Do you have enough information? Do you know if the frog is boiling or not?
I think we are moving in the right direction with that transparency. We see more appetite for that. I cannot say that we have gotten to a point when this is not a concern. We still have too much contingent liability that is not disclosed. We have too much of this short-term transactional approach to that to be fully comfortable.
My next question was going to be on hot flows. You're looking at a whole new framework by which you think about exchange rates and how much portfolio flows are flowing in a particular country, whether there should be capital controls or capital constraints. So what prompted a rethink at the fund from sort of traditional orthodoxy to something new, and what is the something new?
Well, what prompted it is really our membership, especially countries in East Asia, some of the emerging markets in Europe that have been telling us that we have to think about our policy advice in a more modern, up-to-date manner, based on experience that we have accumulated. And we took that to heart. And actually, I want to give credit to my colleagues in the IMF, especially our chief economist. They have been very thoughtfully engaging with the membership to get to a point in which we can credibly say a rethink is necessary. We now know more of what works, what doesn't. We have more tools. Remember macroprudential tools 10 years ago, 15 years ago? Who talked about macroprudential tools? So how do we combine our accumulated knowledge and the new tools we have so we can have these 4 elements in place, monetary policy, specifically exchange rate, how we rely on exchange rate, what more usefully we can do with capital flows, when and how capital controls can be put in place. And last but not least, macroprudential tools. What is their role? And then recognize that our advice cannot be cookie cuts. It has to be tailored to countries and based on engagement with countries. And I can say that so far I have received quite a lot of positive reinforcement for that. Plus, many saying, okay, Miss Kristalina, now that you stuck your neck, please engage us and get to specifics. And this is what we will be doing. Can I actually invite everybody in the audience interested in this topic? We are very open for a dialogue and exchange.
But obviously, capital markets and the pricing through capital markets send important signals to both the recipient, the creditor, and the borrower. Are you diluting those market signals by putting in capital constraints, capital controls? Or, I always heard that capital is a coward. So are you keeping it from flowing where it needs to flow?
I wouldn't say we are going to advertise and advise capital controls. Maybe we won't. All I'm saying is that we need to be much more comprehensive in how we approach policy advice and look at country-specific conditions and then history of what we have learned in other places. If you, remember the East Asia crisis, there were different reactions in different countries, and there is still a lot of bitterness in East Asia. Frankly, some of it directed to my institution. I'm not saying we did the wrong thing. What I'm saying is that we have to learn from every experience and then be much more forward-leaning in our engagement with emerging markets, and much more able to differentiate from one situation to another, and much more willing to be open-minded and inclusive, listening to other opinions. I mean, maybe because of now I see we are close to running out of time, but I'm going to go back to my personal experience. Having lived in a highly ideological environment, I'm really allergic to ideology leading to decisions. I want decisions to be evidence-based, not ideology-based. I was going to tell you a joke from these days, but I see we don't have that much time.
We got time for a joke. Go for it.
We have time for a joke? Well, in my youth, what we have been bombarded with was Marxism-Leninism. And the joke is Marxism-Leninism has three parts. Marxist-Leninist philosophy, looking for a mouse in a dark cellar. Marxist-Leninist political economy, looking for a mouse in a dark cellar, but knowing the mouse is not there. And Marxist-Leninist scientific communism, looking for a mouse in a dark cellar, knowing the mouse is not there, but shouting all the time, here it is, here it is. So I want to focus on finding the mouse and putting the light on it if it is there, and not searching for a mouse if the mouse is not there.
Pragmatic empiricism, I like that. One last question in the last minute. I know that gender equality, diversity has been important to you. It's been important to the fund, not only because it's the right thing to do, but there's macroeconomic implications. In the closing minute, can you tell me a little bit about the fund's role and why you're focused on it?
Well, it is, again, one of these topics that in the world we live today is macrocritical. Why? Because no economy can prosper and be competitive unless it taps into the talent of all its people, men and women. And for this reason, we advocate gender equality. We are extremely proud to have partnered with many of you in that area. I want to congratulate Saudi Arabia for making one of the biggest jumps in women business and the law this year. I spent the afternoon with Saudi women who talked to me about women entrepreneurs, how things have changed in terms of access to property, the ability to reach, to get finance, and of course, what we all have observed, the right to drive. And I know from my own life experience that getting gender equality doesn't fall from the sky. We have to all work for it. What I am determined to see in my lifetime is that women and men contribute to their families, to their communities, to their countries on equal footing, because only then we can have higher growth. We are calculating 3 to 5% boost of GDP if women are equal, and we can live in a more, in a richer, more prosperous, but also more enjoyable, fairer world.
I think that's
zero.
That's a wonderful place to conclude this conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for the Managing Director.
Thank you.